Following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools. Funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
This program was made possible through generous support from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. Fractured Union is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. As the largest and wealthiest colony, Virginia played an essential role in America's struggle for independence and nationhood. 4 Virginians of the elite planter class were critical in shaping our nation. George Washington of Mount Vernon commanded the Virginia Regiment in the French and Indian War. Later, he held local and colonial political positions and served as commander of the Continental Army. He presided over the Constitutional Convention and was our nation's first president. George Mason is often referred to as the forgotten founder. He drafted the influential Virginia Declaration of Rights and was a member of the Virginia delegation to the Constitutional Convention, where he argued against a strong central government. Thomas Jefferson of Monticello authored the Declaration of Independence, served in the Virginia House of Delegates and as Virginia's governor. A delegate to the Congress of Confederation, he also served as the United States Minister to France. Under George Washington, he was the nation's first Secretary of State, then Vice President to John Adams, and the nation's 3rd president. James Madison of Montpelier served in the Virginia State Legislature and as a member of the Continental Congress. At the Constitutional Convention, his Virginia plan became the model for the new United States government. Later, he was elected to the House of Representatives, served as Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, and as the nation's 4th president. Each man played a vital role in forging our nation. Each believed his actions would impact not only himself, but future generations. But while their resolve and their recognition of public trust never faltered, their visions for the future nation differed. Over time, friendships and collegial relationships fractured as each man stayed true to his beliefs in what would best serve the nation and the future. After 8 long years of war, the victorious George Washington resigned his commission as commander of the Continental Army. Washington's act of voluntarily giving up power and returning home to Mount Vernon as a private citizen shocked the world.
Washington really threw down his sword and went back home to his plow. And King George III said, if he really does that, if he really does give up all that power and goes back to his plantation, he will be the greatest man on the face of the earth.
Washington's resignation was without precedent in modern history. Contemporaries had to reach back to classical antiquity to find a comparable example of disinterested civic virtue.
Some people want money, wealth, women. He wanted the respect and love of his fellow men.
Washington's actual feelings on resigning his commission, we can only imagine to some extent. He returns home to his family at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve. And now finally he gets to reunite with Martha and come back into the arms of his family. So it must have been a very, very emotional time for him. He desperately wanted to return back to his farms, to return home to what he loved to do most.
We are home, sir.
We are home, Billy. Thank you. Thank you sincerely. Put these away, please, and go see your brother Frank.
I will, sir. Thank you, sir. Will we ride out to the farms tomorrow, sir?
Well, it's Christmas Day. If not tomorrow, the day after.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Ah, there you are. You are a sight for sore eyes. I resigned my commission in Annapolis town. It is so good to see you. How are you? How are my grandchildren?
They are eager to run to their grandpapa's arms.
Patsy, allow me an embrace.
While Washington believed that he was done with public life, he realized that although independence had been won, the even greater challenge of establishing a strong and united nation lay ahead. Washington and others recognized that trade and commerce were essential to the success of the new nation. But the government under the Articles of Confederation was too weak to effectively regulate trade. Virginia called for a convention in Annapolis to focus on the key issue of interstate commerce.
The principal events that led to the Annapolis Convention were the inability of the states to freely trade among themselves. What was going on is the states were setting up fees for the use of ports, establishing state duties, state tariffs, and it was blocking commerce. And without free commerce and a vibrant economy, there really was no future for the country.
My dear sir, it becomes evident even to the least discerning eye that events over the last several months indicate that the Articles of Confederation just are inadequate to the needs of our United States. I therefore took it upon myself to suggest an introduction of a resolution in the Virginia Assembly, and that might encourage other states to attend a more general convention in Annapolis later this year. I suggest September here in 1786, in the hopes that we may be able to gain some support from several states in calling for amendments to those Articles of Confederation. But the fact that we are doing something may lead to success, and perhaps to the calling of a subsequent convention next year in 1787.
I declare, they are now suggesting in this Annapolis Convention that the Articles of Confederation need to be tampered with. They need to be strengthened and further secured in order to provide for a federal government, oh yes, a strong federal government, that would deny the influence of each of the states, particularly Virginia. Oh, I have often felt that these Articles of Confederation are of a venerable fabric. They should never be tampered with. I shall reply that we should continue to protect and defend our Articles of Confederation, indeed, against an all too powerful federal government.
Only 12 delegates from 5 states showed up at the Annapolis Convention, and so the turnout was very disappointing. The only states there were Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Virginia. The host state, Maryland, was not even present.
It showed the larger issue, that the states just weren't getting along. They weren't cooperating. There was not the sort of a unity of feeling and a harmony under the Articles of Confederation. So it became apparent to the representatives that while commerce was a problem, the larger problem was the functioning of the Articles of Confederation.
What were the 12 delegates to do? They could just give up and go home, but they decided instead to issue a report drafted by Alexander Hamilton of New York. The report, the Annapolis Convention report, pronounced the situation of the Confederacy, quote, delicate and critical.
Those men were all very concerned about the integrity of the United States, and they all had committed so much time and energy and of themselves to the revolution. And they just did not want to see the national government fail and the states collapse into this mass of squabbling petty interests.
The Annapolis Convention report called on all the states to send delegates to another convention to meet the following May 1787 in Philadelphia, to consider all the problems of the Confederation and to render the Articles of Confederation adequate to the exigencies of the Union.
Billy Lee.
Yes, sir, General Washington.
Billy, I need you to post this to Mr. James McHenry immediately on the morrow.
Is this the letter we spoke of earlier?
It is. I finally got around to writing it. You know, we had this Annapolis Convention. I did not attend, but Colonel Hamilton reported to me, along with a few others, 5 states attend. How do we come together when 5 states attend a meeting that should be attended by all of them? There has been a call. Mr. Hamilton is behind it. I support him fully. for a new convention, a convention in Philadelphia City this coming spring, 1787. All the states must attend. We need to rewrite the Articles of Confederation. I support it. I do not intend on going to Philadelphia myself.
General, we have fought and you have led, sir. Surely you are tired.
I am tired, Billy. I'm exhausted. I have given my country public service. You know, when I resigned my commission years ago, 1783, also in Annapolis, I was done with public service. I wanted to come back here. That is what I wanted to do then. It is what I want to do now. I want to be with my family. I want to sit under my own vine, under my own fig tree. I support a convention in Philadelphia. I'm very reluctant to attend myself. We shall see. The letter on the morrow.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
In the spring of 1787, delegates from all but one state gathered in Philadelphia to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Overcoming his reluctance, Washington returned to public life as the presiding officer of the convention.
The idea of going again back into public life was not a very pleasant thought to him, and also he feared failure.
Washington knew that he could bring tremendous prestige to a convention, but he didn't want to blow his prestige on what could turn out to be a failed convention, like the Annapolis Convention, because of low turnout.
Madison ceaselessly worked to convince Washington that this was his responsibility and his duty to attend the Constitutional Convention.
Madison convinced him that the Republic itself would crumble if the Articles of Confederation weren't substantially revised, and Washington felt compelled to protect the Republic even at the sacrifice of his reputation.
The fact that he is going to go makes it a tremendously important meeting. And if he's going to be there, then others want to go, and it takes on prominence that it would not have.
People arrived in Philadelphia with different ideas of exactly what would happen, and it's only as the debates at Philadelphia unfolded, I think it became clear that they would really be overthrowing or scrapping the Articles of Confederation entirely.
The Virginia delegation at the convention was in agreement that when it was time for the states to ratify the new Constitution, they would ask for a Bill of Rights. And they had already agreed to that. But that wasn't enough for Mason. He did not want to empower a new government that did not guarantee the rights of every individual.
Colonel Mason, I thank you for accepting my invitation to dine this evening. There are rumors circulating that you have some reservations in affixing your name to this new document, this new Constitution. I wish to clarify any doubts you have and to clear up any doubts you have about the efficacy of this new government.
I have some grave reservations, sir. We must be cautious. We must be sure that we protect our rights as Virginians. What will keep this supposed limited federal government from intruding upon our business in Virginia?
The nature of the Constitution, sir, the limitations are clearly spelled out. Language could not be any more clear.
We may well be creating a government more despotic and tyrannical in the future than the British have been.
I say there cannot be any more clear meaning to the Constitution than that which is given. And it is essential, sir, that we see unanimous agreement amongst the Virginia delegation for the support of this Constitution. Will you not support it as it stands?
I cannot put my hand to a document that does not provide for the protection of our rights. I do not understand your rush to completion here. We should be deliberate. We should be cautious. We should take care of our rights.
4.5 months of some of the best minds in the country have been deliberating on this very subject, Colonel Mason, in which you have been a part. I must believe that if this energy is necessary to ratify this Constitution, to introduce it to the people, it's going to be...
Convenience be damned, sir. We must be cautious.
Good evening, gentlemen. Oh, set yourself down, Jimmy, please, please.
Please take a seat.
Oh, no, I cannot tarry. I have a prior engagement with Mr. Roger Sherman of Connecticut. But thank you. You know, gentlemen, I must tell you, I could not help but notice that you are engaged in rather spirited discourse. I could hear it all the way down the hallway. And you know some of the things that you are speaking about are confidential in nature to this convention. Although I will tell you that it did put a bit of a smile on my face. I went spinning back and I started to think that all the congresses and convocations and conventions that we have experienced in this city, going back to 1774, the First Continental Congress, is it not true that so much of the real discourse, so much of the debate and the agreements are made in the taverns of Philadelphia City? Is it true?
Indeed.
Well, gentlemen, I don't want to put you off your meal, and I will be late myself. I wish you a good evening. One final thought. I find that when I am engaged in spirited discourse with someone who may have an opposing view to mine, that I am best served, indeed, the nation is best served, if I enter into that discussion with a spirit of amity and concession, mutual concession. I bid you a good night, gentlemen.
Good evening, sir.
George Washington was absolutely essential to the Constitutional Convention. We wouldn't have had a Constitution if he had not presided over that meeting. His stature was something that's very difficult for people in America to understand today, because there's really never been anybody since him with quite that ability to pull the country together.
Washington acted as president of the convention as kind of a nonpartisan, honest broker. He was the center of everything. He was the center in terms of his dignity, in terms of his authority, in terms of his determination to get this done right. And yet at the same time, Washington stood above all of the partisan bickering, all of the worries, all of the uncertainty, all of the personal rivalries. And Washington was able to be that unifying force that kept everybody focused on the common goal.
Madison is rightly called the father of the Constitution, and it was a title that was applied to him in his own lifetime. But he was called that for two reasons. First, he really was the mastermind that brought about the convention and the ratification of the Constitution. And secondly, he was so influential in setting the agenda and intellectually guiding the debates at the convention.
James Madison was the author of the Virginia Plan, which became the blueprint, or the starting point for the convention. And the most important idea behind the Virginia Plan is to get rid of a confederation entirely, get rid of a government of states, and replace it instead with a government of people, a government that operates directly on the people, with the federal government supreme.
Washington and Madison were really close allies. They had strategized together before going, so they had really laid out the game plan, and both agreed that the state of the nation was on the verge of disaster, and that there had to be a national government that had the power and authority to pull the American people, to form them truly into a single nation, a single people.
By the end of the summer, through the hard work of Washington, Madison, Mason, and other delegates, the Articles had been discarded and a new Constitution created.
Jefferson generally supported the idea of a new Constitution. He liked the balance of powers and the division of the executive and legislative and judicial branches of government. He was very concerned, though, that there was no Bill of Rights.
Jefferson followed the events of the Constitutional Convention as closely as he was able, but he is in France and there's a very long lag time between anything coming back and forth on it. His main source of information is James Madison, and the letters he gets from him are very revealing, but they tended to come after the events of the convention were actually over.
Well, they have finally resolved the idea of a constitution. And it doth appear to be the shortest document of its kind in human history. Creating a government to check its own power. 3 distinct branches, each branch checking the power of the other. And the largest branch to be that in the legislative body. Well, that is correct. That body elected directly by the people themselves. we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, admitting therein that our government is not perfect, we must always strive to form a more perfect union. Of course, as it is, this Constitution can be read by any government in power to its own particular ends. What it needs is something to secure it in the hands of the people. But of course, a Bill of Rights does that. A Bill of Rights is what this Constitution needs for not only Americans, but a Bill of Rights is what is necessary for all people across this globe against any government in power, allowing the Constitution to be open to amendment and grow as the people grow. I shall write Mr. Madison, assure him that I am in favor of this Constitution, but desire a Bill of Rights to be amended to it. And if he is to suggest that, these rights are inferred in the Constitution, then I shall demand of him, are we to rest upon inference itself on such an important subject as the rights of man?
Although a new constitution had been created, ratification by all 13 states was by no means assured. Washington followed the ratification debates in all of the states, particularly in his native state of Virginia.
The leadership in Virginia divides very evenly between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. On the Federalist side, George Washington, James Madison, Henry Lee. On the Anti-Federalist side, Patrick Henry, George Mason, Richard Henry Lee, James Monroe.
George Mason and the other opponents to ratification put greater emphasis on the threat to individual rights and liberties, which they felt needed amendments to the federal Constitution as proposed.
The difference between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is their sense of the proper role of government. The Federalists ultimately were most worried about anarchy, and the Anti-Federalists were at core most worried about tyranny.
George Washington received his information from letters that he received from delegates to the Virginia Convention. Most notably, he received letters from James Madison, who was the principal proponent for ratification at the Virginia Convention. He wrote Washington about every 4 or 5 days.
Written correspondence and letters was the electronic mail of the moment. Washington fired off hundreds of letters during this period, and he received even more. Constant stream of correspondence that kept him in touch with politics everywhere in the new nation.
Billy, did you happen to pick up the Post today?
Indeed, this morning I fetched it, sir, and placed it there in your office on your desk.
I don't suppose you happened to notice if there was anything from Mr. Madison.
Well, I took a bit of a peek, sir, and I did see something from Mr. Madison.
I'm anxious to see that letter. It may be very fortuitous. It has been the ratification convention in Richmond City, a series of peaks and valleys.
But, sir, will we be able to head down there and into the fray?
Billy, I have no idea. I'm not a soothsayer. I'm not a prognosticator. It is a complete unknown at this juncture.
But what does the discussion mean for us, General? Will we be back in action again, sir?
Billy, I need to read Mr. Madison's letter first. That way I will have a timely response and be able to convey this to you. It will, I can tell you, mean nothing less than the entire future of this nation.
Sir,
In Richmond, the debate raged on for 3 weeks. The passionate appeals of the Anti-Federalists, Henry and Mason, were countered by the logic of the Federalist Madison.
The principal deficiency in this Constitution is that there is no Declaration of Rights.
I contend that a Bill of Rights is not necessary in a government that is by its nature limited in its scope and authority.
The powers of this general government could supersede and presume the powers of our own state legislatures.
As to those who object to this government being so powerful, we must, upon an examination in the annals of mankind, find that governments that are weak are more likely to fall into states of anarchy.
There is no assurance of protection of the liberty of the press.
If the government has no power to obtrude upon the press, then what need is there to have an amendment to forbid it?
This Constitution must be delayed. We must have another convention and correct these deficiencies.
Let us form the government and then take up the issues of subsequent amendments by the new formed government and the new formed Congress.
Finally, the Constitution was ratified by a vote of 89 to 79, with a recommendation calling for a Bill of Rights.
It is passed, it is ratified, with great help from the governor, Randolph.
General, is that the all of it, sir?
We are now a country with a constitution. And now the work begins. We need to form a government. And that means the election of a chief magistrate. That is what has me concerned.
Sir, you shall be elected, and you shall be like the king of all.
No, we have no kings in United America, Billy. We fought against a king. You were there, right by my side. It is the presidency. I will be asked to stand for the presidency. And that is something that I am of two minds on the subject.
Most historians believe that even during the Constitutional Convention, it was clear that the delegates believed George Washington would be the nation's first president.
The whole idea, the whole concept of the presidential office in the Constitution was created with George Washington in mind. Washington was in many ways viewed as the creator of the American Republic, and there was really no question that Washington must be the first man to lead that republic into the world.
Surprisingly, the United States presidency has much more power than you would expect to be given to an individual man in view of our own fears of too much government power and having rebelled against that kind of thing. But really, their faith in Washington let them trust their hopes more than their fears.
He had conducted himself with disinterested virtue. He had always been honest and upright as commander-in-chief, and they trusted him to use his powers as president in the same way.
On April 14, 1789, Washington received word that he had been unanimously elected. And on April 30, 1789, George Washington was sworn in as President of the United States at Federal Hall in New York City.
It's not easy to be the first of something because you have no role models to follow. Instead, you are the role model for everyone else to follow. And Washington was very aware of that. And he worked so hard to get things right the first time as president because he knew, however he did things, that's how all the successors would do things.
He was very careful not to encroach on the powers of Congress, and he was very careful to avoid any of the pomp and ceremony that Americans attached to royalty, or anti-federalists in particular, were fearful that the president would become a kind of American monarch.
George Washington faced the almost insurmountable challenge of establishing a new nation. He firmly believed the new nation must develop a strong economic base. One of the greatest controversies of his administration was the establishment of the National Bank.
The Federalists believed that in order to have a stable country, you needed to have a stable currency and a stable economy. And the way to create stability in your economy was to have a national bank.
From the Republican point of view, it's not in the Constitution to establish a national bank with all the powers of finance and economy it will have, will give too much power to the central government and favor the wealthy at the expense of ordinary people.
Jefferson found it hard to accept that Washington believed that the Hamiltonian financial system and the national bank were benign, that they weren't dangerous things.
Mr. Madison, I do not wish to appear complaining, but I will continue to stand strongly and argue and debate these ideas of Colonel Hamilton to establish a national bank. Firstly, sir, he is to suggest that this is inferred in our Constitution, that it is there. Is it in our Constitution that a national bank must be established?
I am much against such liberal interpretations of the Constitution. The convention never supported the creation of charters or corporations by this new national government.
I would agree with you. And yet, of course, the influence, the power that he intends in such a national bank is that the finance of our nation be held in the hands of the wealthy, those who can afford it. And what do they intend, sir? They intend, if you would allow, to place a price upon paper, sir. Paper. The price of this paper can go anywhere where they intend it to go, sir. They do not intend to recognize hard money, valid money, money that we can hold in our hands, always worth the value. And oh no, sir, paper is what they intend. And what I fear the most, is now Colonel Hamilton's accessibility to President Washington. He is beginning to have an influence on His Excellency.
But hopefully, Mr. Washington will see the reasoning of Mr. Hamilton. If implying that such a bank is necessary, he seems to suggest that it emanates from the desire to accrue money as being the end. If that is the case, then he ascribes the need for the accrual of capital to pay loans. This becomes then the means to achieve the ends of accruing capital. And then, if that is the case, the accrual of capital becomes the end, and the formation of bank is the means to accrue that capital. If that is the case, according to Mr. Hamilton's explanation, then the creation of the bank becomes the ends, and the formation of a charter and corporation for those banks becomes the means. And we see how diverted we come from the original meaning of that Constitution.
And can you imagine the government of the people, not a government of financiers, not a government of the wealthy? Mr. Madison, the two of us must stand together, seek further influence with General Washington, that he not be held captive to Colonel Hamilton's devices.
Indeed, I believe there is much sentiment in the country that will be supportive of these ideas, and hopefully to countermand the actions of those who are Mr. Hamilton's advocates.
The National Bank was a really difficult thing for the southern states to accept. And Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, was there in the cabinet, but he was a Virginian. And he felt that the National Bank was something that would not be of any use whatsoever to Southern planters, and was there for the Northern merchants.
Washington was well aware that Jefferson and Madison opposed the bank and regarded it as unconstitutional. And Washington suggested to Hamilton that he write a memorandum explaining why the bank was a legal institution.
Colonel Hamilton.
Your Excellency.
You have received and read by now, no doubt, the letter written by another.
The Secretary of State, yes.
His 17 points refuting your desire to have a Bank of the United States of America. I feel that there must be an adequate provision to secure the national debt. These are my feelings. I think it's important. It's important not just to the honor of the country, but indeed to the security of the nation, to the prosperity of the nation. But I want to be able to respond appropriately. I want you to refute his 17 points. To me, right now, I want you to convey it to me not in high and lofty sophisms. I want you to convey it to me as if you were speaking to a fellow citizen at the city tavern.
States, like individuals who keep their engagements, are respected and trusted, while the reverse is true of those who pursue an opposite conduct. Now, these points that the Secretary of State raises in confrontation with the National Bank, it is absolutely imperative for our national credit, and we must have that national credit, that we establish this national bank to support and stabilize our currency, to give us greater facility in the collection of taxes, and to give us loans in time of need. Now, Secretary Jefferson says that we do not have a right to have a national bank because it does not say in the Constitution that we may have a national bank. There are implied as well as express powers written into the Constitution. Then it follows that the erection of a corporation, such as a bank, ought to be allowed as anything else. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that the Congress may make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into effect the listed powers. Then it follows we can have a bank. Yes? But Secretary Jefferson says, no, that a bank is not necessary, that's not what the word necessary means, that it means no more than convenient. Convenient. It is obviously essential to the well-being of the national government that so erroneous a conception of the word necessary be exploded. Neither the grammatical nor popular sense of the term is construed as such. Were we to use the Secretary of State's interpretation of the word necessary, were to presuppose that the words absolutely or indispensably had been prefixed to it. Besides, if we use his interpretation of the word necessary, how are we ever going to get anything done?
Alexander, settle yourself down. You have made your points, and you have done so very well. It is very much in keeping with a letter that I had just written. This paragraph reads, I believe that no measure, the National Bank, no measure can be more desirable, whether viewed with an eye to its intrinsic importance or to the general sentiment of the nation. Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate your explanation. That is all, sir.
Your obedient servant.
The bank is the figurehead, but the real rift is over how do we interpret the Constitution in an appropriate way? Do we interpret it strictly, or do we interpret it loosely?
In signing the bank bill, Washington essentially endorses the view of a living Constitution and an expansive government role.
As the end of his first term as president approached, George Washington looked forward to returning to the life of a private citizen at Mount Vernon. The nation, while growing in strength, was still, however, an experiment in government.
Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton agreed on virtually nothing, except they both strongly agreed that Washington had to stand for a second term. Jefferson made a wonderful brief quote, "North and South will hang together if they can hang on you."
Colonel Hamilton, there is certainly no question that the two of us continue to disagree. Oh, and at times vehemently so. And yet we are, I hope, gentlemen of principle. We well understand that as Americans, a difference of opinion need not be a difference of principle, and therefore I believe we are both allied, are we not, in the necessity of our President, General Washington, to stand for a second term. I would say that the principle of compassion, the principle of virtue, the principle of integrity has been discovered in no other of our nation's history than that of His Excellency, in his character and personality.
Mr. Jefferson, I concur. It is imperative that he stay in his position as President of these United States as long as we can keep him.
Well then, I think this resolution empowers me the more so to pay a visit to His Excellency, which I have been intending to do for some time, that I might suggest to him it is necessary for the continued safety, protection, and defense of our Constitution, let alone the integrity of his cabinet.
Hear, hear. So, Mr. Jefferson, it would seem we agree.
It would seem.
In October 1792, Jefferson visited Washington at Mount Vernon to urge him to consider a second term.
Oh, my goodness. Welcome, Mr. Jefferson.
Your Excellency.
May I be so bold as to inquire as to why it is you grace our door?
Well, I beg your pardon, sir. It is rather impromptu, but I am here on matters of immediate urgency. That urgency is the preservation of our Union. And that preservation, sir, requests that you stand once more for President of the United States. We would have never succeeded without you at the forefront, upholding, sir, not only the principles of that American Revolution, but the morale of the troops and our citizenry. Sir, our nation needs you. It is our duty.
Thomas, I am tired of public labor, sir. I seek retirement here at Mount Vernon. My farms are in disrepair. My businesses falter. I have served so many years.
Sir, our nation may fall into a disrepair. What means the preservation of our personal property when compared with the preservation of the principles of this remarkable nation? Novus ordo seclorum, sir, as the Romans would say, a new order of the ages, which must be preserved by your continual leadership, sir. The nation calls on you once more, sir. I call on you. It is my duty. Your Excellency.
I am, if truth be told, of two minds. I want to see the stewardship of this country continue, but my heart yearns for retirement. I have made a vow to Mrs. Washington that I would not stand for a second term.
I beg your pardon, Your Excellency.
You know, Thomas, throughout my entire life, I have been faced with making choices between my inclination, what I want to do, and my duty, what I must do. You are weary from the road. Allow me to give you some libation to chase the dust, and let us continue this discourse.
Your Excellency, not only are you a man of grace, but as always, great hospitality.
In 1792, there was still no other national figure available. If Washington had not stood again for president, it's very difficult to see who would have been elected other than Adams. And Adams probably would not have been able to hold the country together as effectively as Washington.
By 1793, the two superpowers of the 18th century, England and France, were at war. While many Americans felt that the United States owed France for its support during the Revolutionary War, George Washington wanted to avoid armed conflict with England at all costs.
Colonel, once again, I look to you for counsel. I find myself facing a decision. The nation finds itself at a very tenuous position. Of course, it involves the hereditary enemies, France and Great Britain, the wars that they are engaged in once again, and their efforts to pull us in, each country, to its respective side. I am gravely concerned that this will not bode well for this country. I am curious as to your thoughts, sir.
Well, General, if I may, I know we owe a great debt to France in their aiding us, and we could not have won the war without them. And were that the government that were in power now in France, then I would be of a mind that we might have to support them. But the government that helped us out during the war was the French monarchy, not this directorate. The Marquis de Lafayette languishes in an Austrian prison due to the usurpations of this sister republic of ours.
Of course, the aristocrats saw him as a man of the people. The people saw him as an aristocrat.
Real liberty comes neither in despotism nor in the wild extremes of democracy, but only in moderate governments. Therefore, we must have order. To that end, I do not believe that we can support either France or Great Britain in this conflict. Now, we would not be of a mind to support Great Britain, of course.
I am actually relieved to hear you say that. There are many that say that your leanings are very strong towards Great Britain. Many that also say that Mr. Jefferson's leanings are strong in the other direction towards France. I am relieved to hear what you have to say. I will tell you, I have thought long and hard on this. I believe that excessive partiality for one country, excessive dislike of another, it serves only to allow us to see only dangers from the ones we dislike, and it veils any potential danger from the ones that we like. I must tell you that my thinking leans heavily towards no permanent alliances with any country, certainly not being pulled into a war. We are an infant nation. We are just taking our place on the world stage. Imagine we side with Great Britain, we side with France. We can be brought to our knees like that. And it is for that precise reason, sir, that I am leaning very heavily towards making a proclamation of neutrality for the United States of America.
And I think it highly appropriate that you do so, sir.
I am glad you are in concurrence, sir. Thank you as always, Colonel.
Your servant, sir.
Exercising executive privilege, Washington signed the Neutrality Proclamation in April of 1793. The act once again stirred up disagreement in his cabinet.
Washington's perspective, although he's sympathetic with the French Revolution, especially early before it lurches towards terrorism and the guillotining of many, many innocent people, he's afraid that America's sympathy with France will lead us to hostile action with England, which will lead to a conflict with England, our major trading partner, an absolutely crucial element in Washington's plan for strengthening America.
Jefferson was concerned that Washington was being too influenced by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, who were very pro-British, and he shared Washington's belief in neutrality, but he was concerned that it was actually a front for a pro-British foreign policy.
But again, there's the underlying issue, which is really at core, and this has to do with what is the appropriate functioning of Congress in foreign policy versus the appropriate functioning of the president.
Bob? Oh, Bob.
Yes, Master Thomas.
Oh, very good. Please see that this is sent to President Washington.
Yes, sir.
No, you may look at it. It's merely my opinion upon our nation's stand on neutrality with our former ally France, and with England as well. Imagine that we stand in neutrality. We must remain neutral with our old ally France. Did she not stand by our side and help us through our struggles? And yet we deny ourselves the opportunity to stand along with her during her struggles? Oh, no, we must remain neutral. Remain neutral with England, our former enemy. I beg your pardon, Bob.
Servant, sir.
Mr. Washington has recently issued a proclamation of neutrality in the issue between England and France. Those in this neighborhood feel it's an equivocation, too great a support for the English at the expense of the liberty of the French. I understand that Mr. Jefferson, the Secretary of the State, and a very good friend, has indicated that he is not in favor of this proclamation and may even leave the administration as a consequence. Who else would be more familiar with those matters that led to the proclamation and the decision to issue it? If Mr. Jefferson cannot support it, then neither can I.
This split between Federalists and Anti-Federalists over foreign policy was a catalyst for the development of political parties in America.
When England and France went to war in 1793, it created irreconcilable differences between Republicans and Federalists. The Republicans wanted a neutrality that was sympathetic to France because they thought France was fighting the cause of liberty, that it was an extension of the American Revolution. The Federalists, on the other hand, they wanted a neutrality that was sympathetic to Great Britain because they saw the French Revolution as the American Revolution run amok and basically anarchy, and that the cause of liberty was really best represented by Great Britain.
The Federalists and the Republicans of Washington's administration were our first national parties, but they weren't parties like we have today.
We today think political parties are essential for a democracy, that you must have an opposition to keep government accountable. But the founders were in many ways very optimistic and thought that the different parties, different factions would come together and put the public good first, and they assumed everybody would agree on the public good.
These were two forces contending absolutely for the fate of the new nation. They could not survive together in the long term as parties like the modern Republican and Democratic Party, who accept that they are simply two different ways today of thinking about the same sets of public issues. The Federalists and the Republicans were fundamentally and deeply at war with one another in ways that no subsequent parties ever were.
After serving 2 terms as president, George Washington was determined to retire from public life and return to Mount Vernon. He had guided the nation through the often tumultuous early years of nationhood. His relationships with old friends and colleagues had, in several instances, fractured over differing ideas for this new experiment in Republican government.
I think it's important to remember, though, Washington does break with George Mason over the Constitution, but it's not because George Mason disagreed with him on the Constitution. Washington could be friends with people who disagreed with him. From Washington's perspective, it was the manner in which George Mason sought to defeat the Constitution.
Even before Mason left Philadelphia, he had already drawn up his objections to the Constitution and began circulating it. And that was a move that Washington considered obnoxious.
All the breaks with the famous Virginians that will come, all of them from Washington's perspective, whether accurately or not, impugn his motives.
My dear Colonel Mason.
I do beg your pardon for not arising, but please take a seat with me.
I would be most delighted to, sir, and I do hope you will remain seated. Have you any regrets now about those arguments during the Constitutional Convention?
Indeed, I have many regrets, the greatest of which is the loss of many friendships over my refusal to sign the Constitution. But I also regret that we did not redress those differences and
Washington later referred to Mason as my quondam friend, my former friend, George Mason. And sadly, the two men really did split.
I think Mason regretted the end of his relationship with Washington, but again, he was a man of principle. And if the friendship must end to stand by his principles, then so be it.
Washington and Madison had worked together tirelessly on behalf of the Constitution, but eventually their differing vision of our government pushed them apart.
From Madison's point of view, what he saw was that the Washington administration was adopting policies that were too focused on urban areas, too focused on industrial development, and too focused on a tight alliance with England. And Madison felt that this was not a good path for the country.
Is it not extraordinary? Mr. Washington and I have just left the government in this early part of 1797, he retiring from the presidency, and I from the House of Representatives. Upon reflection, how strange it is that gentlemen of honest intentions, and sound education, and virtuous ambitions can differ so profoundly on the same subjects. How that so indicates the frailty of the human mind and the fragility of a Republican government when honest men come to govern honest men.
The deterioration in the relationship between Washington and Jefferson is actually quite gradual. There's not a sudden open breach.
Jefferson had insisted that Washington serve a second term, and then once Washington was committed to the second term, he felt Jefferson should stay by his side for the rest of the term, but instead Jefferson abandoned him.
Jefferson had worked against his administration even when Jefferson was part of the administration. So for Washington, that was simply something he could not forgive.
But even that doesn't cause the final break between Washington and Jefferson. It was okay to disagree on policy in Washington's view, but what you could not do was to question his character. And that is what Jefferson did at the very end of Washington's presidency.
I will not deny that I have had differences of opinion with President Washington. I know that some of them have angered him. And yet I know that President Washington is a man of principle and character. He understands that jealousies in politics provide the energy of government, and though he disagrees in factions and political parties, I know he well understands that in our nation, one is free to hold their opinion and free to express it in kind.
In the end, while the bonds of friendship frayed, Madison, Jefferson, and Washington recognized the simple truth that honorable men could hold different visions for the future of the United States.
It is interesting when I spin back on my life. My mind goes immediately to the relationships that I have had with various individuals. And I have found that I have worked, but not alone, to establish the particular American character. There have been good and great men. Mr. Mason, Mr. Madison, even Mr. Jefferson. True patriots who have differed in their opinions with me, who have at times presented formidable opposition to what I thought was important for the country. But I also always felt that a difference of opinion did not necessarily mean a difference in principles. At the end of the day, we do what we believe is right. And we do it within the laws that we have established in these United States of America. I must say that in my retirement, while I love Mount Vernon, while I have wished for nothing more than to sit under my own vine and fig tree, I will miss some of the battle. I will miss it.